This time on Poll Hub, we're looking back 50 years to the end of the Vietnam War. For those old enough to remember, it was one of America's bitterest conflicts, not only on the battlefield, but here at home as well. What has changed since then, and what hasn't? We're going to talk about that. But first, we're digging into our new poll of New York State residents, and boy, are we blue. And yes, the state is politically blue, but that's not what we mean here. We are an unhappy state. What is up with that? We'll discuss. Then we have an Easter treat for the fun fact, although even that is likely to spark some serious debate. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Neil Viswanathan.
I'm AJ Gambino.
And I'm Lee Berengoff.
Well, today we're going to start out with the new New York State poll that we released just this week, gauging New Yorkers' opinions on a number of topics, from Governor Hochul's approval rating to congestion pricing. And in this segment, we'll break down some of the most notable and noticeable findings. But I think one of the things that is a key takeaway, Jay, as you mentioned in our open, is, boy, are New Yorkers in a grouchy mood. We take a look at the governor's approval rating. 39% of New Yorkers approve of the job that she is doing as governor. 46% disapprove. 16% didn't weigh in, say that they are unsure, keeping her negative disapproval below 50%. 34% of registered voters statewide think that Senator Chuck Schumer is doing either an excellent or a good job in office. That means that he does hop over the midpoint stripe there, with 56% giving him only a fair or poor rating on the job that he is doing in Washington. And to pile on, 55% of New Yorkers think the quality of life in the Empire State has gotten worse. 64% think New York's economy is getting worse. And 82% of New Yorkers believe that New York's cost of living is not very affordable or not affordable at all. So where do we go from here, guys? The governor is looking at a re-election campaign, not this fall, but a year out from this fall. Things are not going well, according to New Yorkers.
I think when you look at Governor Hochul and as she looks to the future, if you're running 39% approval rating, and you would expect New York City with mostly Democrats to be the best place for her, it is, but even that is only 46%. The suburbs around New York City, the swing area in the state at 38% approval. And as an upstater, she hasn't been able to convince upstate voters that she's doing a decent job, and that number is 32%. And so when we ask about whether she should run for re-election or not surprisingly, only 40% say they would like that, and that is close to her approval rating of 39%. One thing I thought was very interesting in these numbers, Barb, you mentioned the unsures at double digit, 16 on her approval rating. When you look at those folks, they tend to be not unsure about her reelection prospects. They're saying they don't want her to run. And so it's not an act of her needing to convince, just people to, hey, I get a good split on those. So she needs to actually flip those numbers to get her approval rating higher. And in the face of this economy, which you alluded to in detail, things are not pretty in terms of the affordability of the state and quality of life issues. So not a good report card for her at this point, having been in office.
Now, this is often a case for governors and statewide and also city officials, that not all of these things are under their control. If we're thinking about the midterms down the road, at this point, does it look more like we're going to end up having just throw the bums out regardless of party? Or do you think this is something where the finger will be pointed in one partisan direction or the other?
Yeah, I think we're a ways out from that, and I don't know. I think what's interesting in this poll is that there's a bit of a bipartisan agreement that things aren't great in New York, although Democrats are a little more positive. I would point out a couple things. We've asked the question about feeling, right direction, wrong direction since 1990. It's a long time. New Yorkers have never, for a long time now, have not been happy about the right direction. The last time right direction was at 50% or above was in July 2020. So it is fairly recent, 58%. But you go a long way, all the way back to 2002 and 2003 before you get consistent month after month positive feelings from New Yorkers. So this is not a new funk. And one of the questions I have, and when you look at our data and you're looking at the partisan breakdown, how much of this has to do with Republicans are unhappy because Democrats run the state? Democrats are unhappy because Donald Trump runs the country. How much of this is everybody's in a funk, but for different reasons? And I don't know that our survey data tells us that, but I have a suspicion that that may be part of what's going on. Is that fair, you think?
I think certainly we are not unfamiliar with these two worldviews, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a benefit for one party or the other. I think the fact that there is this unsteadiness, this uncertainty, and certainly the feeling that economically things are not going well. I mean, I understand, what you're saying about the right direction for New Yorkers in a sense, even when we look at Senator Schumer's approval rating, 20% of New Yorkers describe the job he's doing in Washington as fair. And probably for about a third of those, that's the highest grade they're going to give him. I mean, New Yorkers don't generally tend to get too excited about being positive about a number of different issues. But I think that said, I think the economy is something that certainly is an overarching theme that should cause significant concern to office holders, regardless of party. And I think that until some of that uncertainty and unsteadiness is balanced out, I think it is going to be laid at the doorstep of executives and office holders, regardless of their positions.
Lee, my highlight of this poll, the thing that stood out to me, and this is more from an inside politics thing, but Chuck Schumer, should he remain as the leader of the Democrats or should he be replaced by another Democrat? 50% of Democrats in New York State, remember he's our senior senator, say he should remain. 48% say he should be replaced. That was stunning to me.
Yeah, it took the words right out of my mouth, Jay. That's exactly where I was going to go on this. So what does this mean? Is the Democratic Party split? Is this a reflective of the rift between kind of like the Washington older generation, status quo, Democrats, or is the progressive AOC element touring with Bernie Sanders right now and getting huge crowds around the nation is a reflective of that? Now, if there is that kind of split, then what happens to Governor Hochul in 2 years? Well, it is the midterm election. Usually the Democrats do better in the midterm election. Donald Trump, it's hard to say what that's going to mean in a year and a half, 2 years in terms of the economy and whether it's tanked or showing some signs of life. But Governor Hochul may be vulnerable to a primary within her own party, and saying she was only elected by, I believe, single digits last time in a surprisingly closer contest than people had thought. Maybe that's part of what's going on. And
But the governor's race is a long way off. Chuck Schumer, this is now. I mean, what's happening with Democrats in the Senate, this is a much shorter time horizon. And I just found these numbers, especially with some of the other data we've seen from other polls about AOC, I just think Chuck Schumer he's a very smart politician. He's got to be looking at this saying, I've got some work to do.
Well, also his actions on the continuing resolution, sort of took the energy. I understand his reasoning. I understand what he said in terms of rationale, but it sure took some of the energy out of Democrats, partisan Democrats, who really want to draw the line in the sand with Donald Trump and say, we don't support whatever Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid cuts, closing the Department of Education. I think they were looking to him as one of probably not if the biggest leader of the party, certainly, up there in the top few. And I think some people were disappointed in that. And I think that's what we're seeing in these numbers here, where you get pretty much half the Democrats saying, I'm not happy with continuing him as minority leader.
Well, also, I think he's seen as one of the leaders of the party. And Lee, as you've pointed out a number of times, if you look at the last 16 years of office holders in Washington, in presidential administrations, Democrats have held power in the White House for 12 of those 16 years. So it's not surprising that a lot of these issues and problems would be laid at the Democrats' doorstep. And I think that there's a lack of definition as to what the Democrats actually do stand for. And certainly Senator Schumer is going to be taking the brunt of that from very blue New York, who was very supportive of Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, who have been at the forefront of a lot of the more progressive movements in the Democratic Party. And so to say he has a lot of work to do is probably an understatement.
So it's been 50 years, and for those of us who were alive and adults at the time, or almost adults, it's hard to believe it's been 50 years since the fall of Saigon. Some of the pictures, the helicopter hovering over the embassy, in everybody's memory from that era anyway. And so we wanted to revisit that because the Vietnam War was a real milestone, a turning point in American history in so many ways. And 50 years later, it's not talked about a whole lot. A lot of the veterans have passed away. That generation is aging. And the relationship that we have with Vietnam is incredibly different than it was 50 years ago. So 50 years later, where are we? Let's go back in time to June of 1965. This is just a few months after the first U.S. combat troops were officially deployed. And at the time, a Gallup poll found that only 23% of Americans wanted the U.S. government to reduce or stop military activities in Vietnam. In June of 65, the Vietnam War was popular. By December of 1969, it's only 4 years, but a very long 4 years in American history. Gallup found 49% of Americans wanting the military to either withdraw immediately or gradually within the next year. By 1975, at the time of the fall, a Opinion Research Corporation poll found that 68% of Americans believe that the U.S. should discontinue all military aid to South Vietnam. At this point, troops were out. And then two more numbers, and then we want to bring in Neil, who's one of our producers, who is part Vietnamese and has a lot to say about this. Nearly 60 years after the war, CBS News asked in January of 2018 about this and found that 51% of Americans believe the U.S. should have stayed out of Vietnam. That's remarkable. Half of Americans saying we shouldn't have gone in. But in 1985, CBS News and the New York Times asked that question, and 73% said we should not have gone in. So there's been an ebb and flow about this. Neil Viswanathan, one of our producers, you were interested in this topic. You are half Vietnamese. When you see these numbers in the context of your history and American history, what do you think? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I don't know personally if I, lived during this period in America, if I would support the war, if I wouldn't support the war. But the war happening is kind of responsible for my whole existence. So that's I always find that kind of interesting.
Explain a little bit to the extent that you want to what that means.
Yeah, so my mom was born in Vietnam. She was born in South Vietnam, and my grandfather was in the South Vietnamese Navy, so he was fighting. And then the day Saigon fell in 1975, my grandma, my mom, and then her two sisters hopped on a ship and sailed to Guam. I don't think they even knew where the boat was going. They just hopped on, and at that point they thought any place was better than Vietnam. So they hopped on a boat, got to Guam, and then I believe my grandpa was reunited with them in Guam shortly after. And then they moved from there to Fort Chaffee in Arkansas, lived there for about a year, and then finally settled in East Texas, near the Louisiana border, pretty much, between Houston and Louisiana, in that area of East Texas. And there's a large Vietnamese American population there. But yeah, that's what I mean. I find it interesting because, I'm not saying I would or I wouldn't support the war if I, lived in America during that time. But whether I would support it or wouldn't support it, it's responsible for my existence. So I kind of feel a more emotional connection to it.
I would point out that given my age group, we started, in my experience, obviously very different than yours, but we started bombing in North Vietnam when I was in 8th grade, and we left the war when I was in my second year of graduate school. So as someone who was here during that time, all of my high school and all of my college years and, a year and a half or 2 years of graduate school were during that period. And to me, I had a student deferment, and so I was not eligible for the draft at that point. but it was a war that didn't feel like it was ever going to have an end to it. I'm curious if your mom talks about it or any other relatives, did they also have this sense of this is sort of, this is with us. It's, here. It's not going away anytime soon. And because it was such a lengthy part of people's lives. I don't know if they had that feeling.
No, definitely. So like my mom was born in 1969, so she was born during the war, and so she, for the first 6 years of her life, lived in like a war-torn country. So I feel like definitely if you're born into that, like she definitely felt like it was just never going to end, especially being directly involved in it with my grandfather being in the South Vietnamese Navy. And then even when they came over to America, there were still those like lasting effects of, racism and stuff like that. Like when she lived in Arkansas, when they lived in Arkansas for, I think it wasn't too long, it was about a year or two, I believe, but they basically were treated as like almost like sharecroppers, kind of like they basically were forced to work the land by the family that like sponsored them because they were refugees, immigrants. I don't think they were necessarily looked at as the same as American citizens. So even after the war was effectively over and they were in America, they were still feeling those lasting effects of like anti-Vietnamese sentiment, anti-communist sentiment, even though they weren't communists themselves at all.
I'm thinking that if the national attitudes towards our involvement in Vietnam have shifted, as Jay indicated in the poll results, I'm wondering if some of those feelings that they felt as refugees have changed now that they've obviously, your family is very much more rooted in the United States.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like I feel like at this point we're pretty well like assimilated. Like I was born here, all my cousins were born here. My mom's younger sister was born here, and I feel like since the war, the Vietnamese American population has skyrocketed in America, especially in regions like Houston, New Orleans, like areas where my mom's side of the family kind of settled. And also, I know California, they have a huge Vietnamese population. And I think another thing that's interesting is that not just the Vietnamese people that I've encountered in America, but as a whole, like they tend to be more conservative. And I think, in my opinion, part of that is because when you grow up in a communist nation like Vietnam, and then you come over to America, and then you start hearing words like democratic socialism and things like that, even though they aren't necessarily associated with socialism or anything like that, you kind of want to stay far away from almost overcorrecting like what you've seen in your childhood, stories that you've heard from your family. So I think that's definitely very interesting about the Vietnamese American population.
Yeah, Neil, I wanted to jump in with that because you are very plugged in politically, in terms of just the content that we talk about here. Quite a few years back now, Lee did a class at the 50th anniversary of 1968 and focused heavily on Vietnam. And I'm just curious from an academic standpoint, when you study politics and when you analyze politics, does your personal history impact your view toward, say, issues like foreign policy and views toward international conflict?
I think absolutely, because when I think of things like immigration and accepting refugees and things like that, like it's hard for me to not, sympathize with that, because if presidents such as like Gerald Ford were not as willing to accept immigrants from countries like Vietnam, then I wouldn't be here today. So I definitely feel, whether it's for the greater good or not, I do definitely feel a personal attachment to some of these issues, and that definitely leads to the way I feel on a lot of things such as immigration.
You did note that there's a big population, and so much of the Vietnamese population in America is because of what you just said, which is we accepted refugees. There were only 15,000 Vietnamese in America before the war. There's 1.3 million today in 2022, and like you, so many, almost all, trace directly to the refugees that came out of South Vietnam. In a 2023 Pew poll, 84% of Vietnamese Americans had a favorable view of the U.S. Do you and your mom and your cousins, your family, do you have the same sense that Americans feel that way about Vietnamese now? For instance, do different generations talk about Vietnam or talk to you or treat you in different ways based on their experience?
I think definitely the older generations of Vietnamese Americans almost tend to love America more, I would say, because they know what it's like to grow up in a war-torn country. Not even just grow up, but also live a lot of their adult lives. Like my grandparents moved over here. They were in their 30s. They had lived like much of their adult life in Vietnam under communist rule. So I think definitely the older generations feel almost more love for America, and then my generation, you know, we were all born here. We might only be like myself, like half Vietnamese. So then we definitely feel, I don't want to say less of a connection to Vietnam, but we feel more assimilated in America. So I feel like we almost take it for granted sometimes.
Have you been back?
I haven't. I'm actually going this summer for the first time.
Oh, wow.
With my mom, my aunt, my dad, and my cousins.
Oh,
my
that's going to be
sister.
fascinating.
Yeah, first time. My mom's been back a couple times. My grandparents have been back a couple times as well. Then my sister went once with my mom. And
I assume you still have some relatives there.
Yeah, yeah. My mom. So both my grandparents still have siblings that live there. And then because of that, my mom has cousins on both sides that still live there.
I can't wait to hear your reactions because your view is so focused by that to actually now get to see and feel what your feelings are now and to get confirmation or change with that is just it's going to be really fascinating.
So you've given yourself an assignment, Neil. Even though you're graduating, you now have to come back because there's part 2 of this segment that we will do after you get back, and we can talk about your experience returning, not for you returning, but going to Vietnam for the first time. That should be great.
And careful, Lee may bring you into one of his classes to speak.
Gladly, I'll do that.
Yeah, that would be really, really interesting for sure. And I don't even need an anniversary date to do it. It's just Neil returns to Maris. That'll be good enough. So let us turn gears to a much more contemporary topic.
Well, I mean, Easter's thousands of years old too. So
well, that's true. But you caught me off guard on that for sure. But it's what people feel now about that. And the CBS did do a poll in 2016, wanting to know, and I think this is kind of important, which type of Easter candy do you like more, chocolate eggs or jelly beans? Nationally, the answer was chocolate eggs, 64%, jelly beans, 28%. I don't necessarily celebrate Easter, but I would certainly want to be around a table that has jelly beans just, all over. I like them in fistfuls. Someone else jump in, and I was told this might be somewhat controversial, so I'm surprised to see where the line's going to be drawn here. But Mary, why don't you come in on this one?
I love jelly beans. It doesn't even have to be Easter. I love jelly beans. And, you can get chocolate pretty much any time of the year. Yes, you can get jelly beans any time of the year as well, but it's not really the same. And now there are all sorts of different flavors. I do like the classics, but my family, we like the Starburst. And no, Starburst is not sponsoring our podcast at all, but the Starburst flavors are really kind of fun. So yeah,
we could do a bid. We can have Jelly Belly bid for rights, and then
yes.
Starburst, and see who pays more. Yeah,
it's not a bad idea, Jay. So Jay, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't understand. I would have thought this was 50-50. How are only 28% of Americans jelly bean? I don't know. I'm total team jelly bean. Total. That's all I got to say. Total team. And the flavors. I mean, the flavors now. There's a pear, like a Bosque pear or Bartlett pear, and it tastes like a pear. I love that. Anyway.
Me too. I'm jumping on the jelly bean wagon.
Wow. Okay. And,
I generally do. I do fancy, chocolate throughout the year, but for some reason, it's only in the spring and around Easter time that the jelly beans seem to be everywhere. So I do see them as a treat. I definitely agree that the flavors are amazing. If we're kind of giving shout outs to different places, there's a wonderful candy store in Ridgefield, Connecticut that is absolutely amazing. And downstairs is jelly bean heaven. In fact, the floor has a linoleum of jelly beans.
Oh, how cool. I love that. Maybe they'll sponsor
another
us.
podcast sponsor. I think that's right.
Okay, so is this a generational divide? Because 4 of us are in the minority, according to this poll.
I actually agree with you guys. I also prefer jelly beans. I tend to prefer all like fruit candy, sour candy instead of chocolate.
Wow. AJ, are you going to?
Yeah, I might have to go with the controversial opinion here and say that I hate jelly beans and love chocolate.
No.
Not only is he going to prefer chocolate eggs, he just said he hates jelly beans.
Yeah,
my goodness.
That is controversial.
Have you tried the new flavors? Is it the texture?
No. I don't think I will try them. I just don't like the texture, anything about it.
No.
Do you actually like chocolate eggs, though? Or is it just you don't like jelly beans?
I like chocolate eggs, but it's more the hate for jelly beans. I despise them.
So Nick.
Well, you're in the majority. I don't know if the majority hates jelly beans.
Now we have a negative. I mean, it's not just what you like; it's dislike.
It's what you don't like.
It's contrary. I have been accused of connecting every topic to politics, which I think I just did.
About Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan.
You knew it was coming, Jay. You knew
I knew it was coming. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Ronald Reagan famously probably increased sales of jelly beans by a certain percent, I'm sure, and he was famous for that. But anyway, well,
Always having a jelly bean jar on his desk. But I mean, this is back in the 1980s, Lee. How far have jelly beans come since then?
Totally, yes, and definitely, and I think you go from now because it's almost acceptable during the holidays to do that, right? So I mean, it's like, you might not want to do it year round because obviously it's a little sugary, but certainly the holidays are a time to partake. But anyway,
indulge.
Yep, there you have it. Enjoy your jelly beans, everybody. If you follow your podcast lead here, it should be a jelly bean fest. Anyway, talk to you next week, folks.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro, and AJ Gambino.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.